For much of the 19th century, Britain's settler colonies, the colonies that we now call Australia, New Zealand, and parts of South Africa and Canada, were seen by many within Britain essentially as dumping grounds for the poor, or perhaps places where disgraced minor aristocrats or buccaneering capitalists could go and make their fortune. They didn't feature particularly prominently in the British political imagination. There had been an attempt earlier in the century to try and give a more positive gloss to settler colonialism, with some success. But it was only really in the last 3 decades of the 19th century that settler colonies began to play a much more positive role in the way that many in Britain thought about the empire and world politics more generally. For some, the settlement colonies were merely a continuation of British society overseas. British ideas, values and institutions were simply being transposed from the so-called motherland to pastures new. For others, however, the colonies performed an almost utopian role. Whilst Britain was overcrowded, decaying, mediocre, a country of industrial slums and satanic mills, the frontiers of colonial settlement represented not just extensions of Britain, but a chance to create new forms of political community. This idea of a Greater Britain, the British nation, or the British race as it was sometimes called, transformed into a global diaspora, engaged the imagination of those at both ends of the political spectrum.
You have to remember that places like New Zealand and Australia were far more progressive in many respects politically than Britain was itself. New Zealand, of course, most famously is the first country in the world to give women the vote. The franchise was much more extensive in all of the colonies than it was in Britain. So for working men in particular, for much of the century, the colonies actually looked an extremely friendly environment in which to be based. So it's not surprising that some political radicals and some socialists did see Greater Britain as a space in which a more progressive and more egalitarian politics could be enacted and played out. And potentially even one in which the motherland itself, Great Britain, could be democratised from the colonies. So that if we link all the political communities together more closely, this might have positive political effects on Britain itself. So that was one line of argument. There were plenty of other socialists and radicals who fundamentally opposed Greater Britain, seeing it as the latest iteration of imperialism, seeing it as negative in all sorts of different ways. So I don't want to suggest that there was a single socialist position on this, far from it. But nevertheless, there was quite significant support. Conservatives supported Greater Britain for very different reasons in many ways. Many of them saw the increasing democratisation of Britain, slow as it was, and we have to remember that it was incredibly slow, as a threat in all sorts of ways, as a threat to establish privileges and hierarchies at home, but also as a threat to the empire itself. And so one of their fears was that by giving ever-increasing numbers of men the vote, of course still very little thought at the time, amongst the dominant elites at least, of giving women the vote, but the thought was that if we give increasingly large numbers of working men the vote, they will vote against empire. They will look after their own interests, and that will typically involve them either becoming or being ambivalent about empire or being actively opposed to it. And so therefore, it's important to try to create a Greater Britain which nullifies or reduces this possibility. And one way of doing that is to support systematic emigration from the cities.
Many at the time saw the industrial slums of Britain's great cities as the threat, as breeding grounds for potential socialists. By encouraging and perhaps funding emigration of many poor city dwellers to the colonies, their radical politics could be neutralised. It was hoped that the transformation of their environment, the conditions under which they lived, would transform their political views. The alienated urban working class would become rugged, virtuous settlers.
Greater Britain was a very loose term. It was an umbrella under which lots of different people could travel and proselytise their own particular political visions. It's one of its strengths, on the one hand, because it allowed for all kinds of alliances between people that might otherwise disagree, but ultimately it was also one of its weaknesses, because, as it happens, people did end up disagreeing pretty heavily on what exactly Greater Britain was, and therefore what needed to be done to bring it about or to secure it. At one end of the spectrum, you might say there was an incredibly vague and amorphous notion where Greater Britain just referred to the collection of peoples who regarded themselves as British in one way or another and who happened to be spread throughout different communities around the world. People who supported this vision were keen to maintain connections of one kind or another with British emigrants in Australia and New Zealand. They wanted them to be recognised more positively, and they wanted them to be involved in all sorts of sort of economic and cultural transactions, but it didn't really involve much more than that. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are those that saw Greater Britain as potentially a global federal state in the making.
Most enthusiasts for Greater Britain were somewhere in the middle of these two positions. They were keen to further develop political links between Britain and the settler colonies, but tended to shy away from more radical plans that proposed a federal structure to coordinate the different parts of this new political community. Much as they might have wanted to see a new transoceanic state, they recognised that it was deeply unrealistic within the current political culture, and therefore opted for much less ambitious plans.
Technology played a fundamental role in all of these different conceptions of Greater Britain. So whether you were a radical federalist or whether you believed simply in moderate tinkering with the existing structure, the fact that new communications technologies allowed communication across great distances instantaneously meant that a sense of community, a sense of belonging, could be utilised to reinforce the sense of Britishness. So whereas in the 18th century and for much of the 19th century, it would take weeks, possibly months, to communicate with people by letter who were across the oceans, by the time the electrical telegraph reached from Britain to these outposts of empire, communication was near enough instant. And this was seen to fundamentally transform the conditions of politics. It allowed people to imagine themselves as part of a single political community. Of course, many of the people who are populating Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on and so forth are emigrants from Britain. So they already have very strong connections with the motherland. And this just serves to reinforce them. It allows them to maintain contact with their families and friends back home. It allows them to read newspapers the day after they were printed in London. It allows them to share in the rituals of national identity and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that it reinforces an existing set of national affiliations to Great Britain. But at the same time, there are complex currents of settler nationalism emerging within the colonies. Now, nationalist historians of Australia, New Zealand, Canada and so on tended to see this as in significant tension with or as an antithesis to Britannic nationalism, so that you get the emergence of a distinct Australian national identity which is defined partly in opposition to being part of the British Empire. And that may well happen much, much later in the history of empire, during the middle decades of the 20th century, say. But during the closing decades of the 19th and the early decades of the 20th century, these two forms of affiliation went hand in hand. They weren't in tension. You could be simultaneously a proud Australian and a member of the wider British diaspora.
There were, of course, minorities within the settler colonies. The French-speaking Quebecois in Canada, or the Irish in Australia, for example, who were either deeply ambivalent about, or resistant to, attempts to impose or deepen a sense of Britishness. Even so, within these populations, there was occasional support for being at least part of a grand imperial structure. The flexibility of the idea of Greater Britain, its lack of a precise definition, stimulated considerable debate about who was included in or could become part of this family of Britishness.
There is, for instance, great ambiguity and disagreement about whether the United States is or should be part of that Greater Britain, that Anglosphere, or again sometimes often at the time, a racialised language of Anglo-Saxonism is used. So for some people the United States is or should be part of that global family of Britishness. For some people, the, quote, Anglo-Saxon Germans ought to be invited into it. Remember that Cecil Rhodes, when he established the scholarships in Oxford that were going to perpetuate his name, originally included German as well as American and British colonial students in the scheme. There's lots of doubt and ambiguity and dispute about whether Ireland and the Irish really belong to the family or not. And fascinatingly, though more at the margin, about whether non-white subjects of the empire might be or might in future become really part of the family. The intensely racialised discourse of so much public life in that time tended to proclaim or assume that they weren't, they couldn't be. This was a whites-only affair, as in its origins really the Commonwealth was. But you do get significant numbers, especially amongst educated elites, in most obviously the Caribbean, but also in West and Southern Africa, in Bengal and elsewhere, saying, no, we are British too. We are part of this Greater Britain, we are part of this family, and we demand the rights that come from membership in the family.